An ordinary day at the airport turns into a moment that no one saw coming when a black woman is wrongly harassed only for the tables to turn in the most shocking way. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, if you enjoy powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. And let us know in the comments where are you watching from? It all started with a routine security check. Passengers moved through the lines, the air buzzing with the usual sounds of travel: rolling suitcases, flight announcements, murmured conversations. But then, an officer's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, step aside for additional screening." Maya Lawson, an off-duty FBI agent, barely reacted at first. She had been through airport security more times than she could count. But something about the officer's tone made her pause. Then, she saw the look in his eyes. And she knew this wasn't just routine. The airport hummed with the sounds of rolling suitcases, scattered conversations, and the occasional overhead announcement crackling through the speakers. Travelers bustled through the terminals, some rushing to catch connecting flights, others taking their time at coffee stands and kiosks. A mix of faces from different backgrounds moved about, their expressions ranging from exhaustion to anticipation. Security lines snaked across the floor, passengers shifting impatiently as TSA officers directed them through metal detectors and body scanners. Maya Lawson stepped into the queue, rolling her carry-on suitcase behind her. She was dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a simple white blouse, her long, dark curls pulled into a sleek ponytail. Her eyes scanned the crowd with quiet observation, a habit ingrained from years in law enforcement. She knew how to read a room, how to spot tension before it escalated. But today, she wasn't here on duty, at least, not officially. She was heading to Washington, D.C., for a counterterrorism summit, a gathering of some of the nation's top intelligence officials. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag. Though she was used to airports, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety that came with being a black traveler. It was something she had learned to navigate, a silent awareness of how she was perceived, of the small but significant differences in how security personnel treated people who looked like her. She had been through it before. The second glances, the prolonged checks, the so-called random screenings. It was never said aloud, but it didn't have to be. She could feel it. A few feet away, Officer Brian Carter stood at his post, his eyes scanning the line. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a sharp gaze that he prided himself on. He had been with TSA for nearly 15 years and considered himself an expert in spotting suspicious behavior. His instincts, as he called them, had led to a few commendations over the years. He watched passengers carefully, making split-second judgments on who required extra screening. When his gaze landed on Maya, something in him clicked. He didn't know why, but something about her put him on edge. She was too composed, too unreadable. He had seen that type before, the ones who acted like they had nothing to hide, but in his experience, that meant the opposite. He signaled to one of his colleagues, whispering something under his breath before stepping toward the line. Maya reached the front, handing over her ID and boarding pass. The officer at the podium glanced at them, nodded, and waved her through. She moved to the conveyor belt, slipping off her shoes and placing her bag in the tray. She was about to step through the scanner when Carter intercepted her. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for additional screening." His tone was firm, authoritative. Maya blinked, her jaw tightening slightly. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. She turned to him, keeping her expression neutral. "I've already cleared the initial check," she said calmly. "It's a random screening," Carter replied, though there was no randomness in his decision. Maya nodded once, stepping to the side. The process was familiar. Hands patting down her arms, her back, her legs. Fingers brushing over the edges of her pockets. She kept her breathing steady, swallowing the irritation bubbling in her chest. The officer checking her moved quickly, professionally, but it was Carter's eyes that lingered, watching her reaction, waiting for something. When they finished, Maya reached for her bag, but Carter stepped forward. "Bag check," he said. Maya clenched her teeth. She watched as he unzipped her suitcase, rifling through her neatly packed clothes and personal items. A few passengers in line looked on, some with sympathy, others with mild curiosity before turning back to their own concerns. She crossed her arms, inhaling deeply. It wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was about the principle. About how, in all her years of travel, she had seen others breeze through security without a second glance while she was treated like a potential threat. Carter pulled out a small black case and turned it over in his hand. "What's this?" Maya stared at him, unimpressed. "My travel-size toiletries. You can open it if you'd like." He did, unzipping the case only to find exactly what she had said: lotion, toothpaste, a small bottle of perfume. He gave a tight nod, placing it back in her bag, but not before giving her another once-over. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Maya took her ID from the tray and placed it in her pocket. "Washington, D.C. For business or pleasure?" She leveled him with a steady gaze. "Business." Carter seemed to chew on that for a moment before stepping back. "You're clear to go." Maya nodded once, reclaiming her bag. She slipped her shoes back on, rolling her shoulders as she walked toward the boarding gates. But she could still feel the weight of Carter's stare, as if he was waiting for her to do something wrong. She had played his game. Now, she just had to decide if she was going to let it slide. Maya walked through the terminal, her pulse steady but her mind restless. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy on her chest, but she pushed it down. This wasn't the first time, and it likely wouldn't be the last. She had learned to let these moments roll off her back, to keep moving forward. Still, something about this encounter with Officer Carter felt different. It wasn't just the inconvenience, it was the way he had looked at her, as if waiting for her to slip up, as if he had already decided who she was before she even spoke. She approached a cafe near her gate, deciding a cup of coffee might help settle her frustration. As she waited in line, she noticed a young black man, likely in his 20s, standing nearby with his phone angled toward the security checkpoint. His face was tense, his eyebrows pulled together as he focused on the screen. When he noticed Maya watching him, he hesitated before stepping toward her. "I saw what happened back there," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Maya tilted her head, studying him. He had a wiry frame, sharp features, and the kind of restless energy she recognized in younger activists. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before," she replied, offering a small but knowing smile. "Doesn't mean it's right," he countered. He gestured toward his phone. "I recorded part of it. People need to see how they treat us differently." Maya exhaled through her nose, appreciating his intent but knowing the complexity of the situation. "I get it," she said, "but sometimes, the way we handle things matters just as much as exposing them." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. "They need to be held accountable." She didn't disagree. But accountability and change weren't always the same thing. A few feet away, an older black woman, dressed in a beige travel suit, watched the exchange with quiet interest. She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Maya's arm. "Baby, you handled yourself with grace back there," she said softly. Her voice carried the warmth of experience, the kind of wisdom that came from years of enduring and surviving. Maya smiled, genuinely this time. "Thank you." The woman patted her arm before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Maya took her coffee and found a seat near the window. She stared out at the tarmac, watching the slow, methodical movements of ground crew preparing flights for departure. She let her fingers drum lightly against the side of her cup, the confrontation with Carter replaying in her mind. She thought about the people in line, some who had looked away, others who had watched but said nothing. She thought about how quickly Carter had targeted her, about how many others had been through the same thing but didn't have the means to challenge it. She thought about what she could have done differently. And then, for the first time since she left the checkpoint, she let herself think about what she could do next. Back at the security station, Officer Carter leaned against the counter, watching travelers pass through. His supervisor, a tall man with graying hair, approached with a clipboard in hand. "Carter, got a minute?" Carter straightened up. "Of course." The supervisor glanced at the checkpoint, then back at him. "A few complaints came in about that last screening." Carter tensed. "I was just doing my job." The supervisor sighed. "Just be careful. The last thing we need is bad optics. You know how sensitive things are these days." Carter nodded, but his jaw clenched. He didn't like the implication. He had done everything by the book. At least, that's what he told himself. But as he scanned the terminal, his eyes landed on Maya again, sitting near the gate with her coffee. And for some reason, he had the distinct feeling that this wasn't over. Maya glanced at her watch. Her flight would begin boarding soon, but her mind wasn't on the time. She was still thinking about the way Carter had looked at her, the way he had treated her as though she didn't belong, as though she was suspicious just for existing in the space. She knew she should let it go, but something inside her refused to move on. She pulled out her phone and typed out a quick message to her colleague, Agent Daniel Reeves, one of her closest friends at the bureau. Maya, got held up at security. Racial profiling at its finest. Daniel, you okay? Maya, yeah. Just the usual nonsense. Daniel, want me to make some calls? Maya, not yet. I want to handle this my way. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and took a deep breath. The young man who had recorded the incident earlier was still nearby, watching the checkpoint like he was debating whether to post the video online. Maya understood his frustration. She had felt it 100 times before. But she also knew that if the video went viral, it would become bigger than just her. It would turn into a debate, an argument, a political spectacle. She needed to make sure this was handled the right way. A movement near the security station caught her eye. Officer Carter was still there, speaking to his supervisor. He seemed tense, arms crossed tightly, his mouth set in a hard line. Whatever conversation he was having didn't seem to be going in his favor. She watched as he shook his head slightly, then turned his gaze back toward the terminal. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Maya held his gaze, unflinching. She could see the flicker of something in his expression, frustration, maybe even doubt. But he didn't look away. Neither did she. A voice crackled over the airport speakers, announcing the first boarding call for her flight. Maya exhaled slowly, pushing herself up from her seat. She grabbed her bag, smoothing her blazer before heading toward the gate. As she approached, the older woman from earlier, Mrs. Daniels, as Maya had overheard someone call her, smiled knowingly. "You handled yourself well, but don't let it end there," Mrs. Daniels said. Maya tilted her head. "What do you mean? You have a badge, don't you?" Maya hesitated. She wasn't in uniform, and she hadn't identified herself at security. "How did you know?" Mrs. Daniels chuckled softly. "I've been around long enough to recognize people who walk with purpose. You're not just anybody." Maya smiled despite herself. "I try to pick my battles." Mrs. Daniels gave her a thoughtful look. "Then pick this one." Maya nodded slowly. She knew the woman was right. She had a responsibility, not just as an FBI agent, but as a black woman who had been through this too many times before. If she let this go, Carter would keep doing it to others. She adjusted the strap on her bag and turned toward the gate. As she walked away, she made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maya stepped onto the plane, her mind still occupied with the events at security. As she found her seat in first class, she placed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled in. The weight of the morning clung to her, but she forced herself to focus. She had dealt with worse. She had faced criminals, interrogated suspects, and handled high-pressure operations. Yet, somehow, these small moments of prejudice always found a way to cut deeper. She stared out the window as passengers filled the cabin. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman stole a glance at her before quickly looking away. It was subtle, but Maya caught it, another reminder that she was being assessed, categorized, judged. She let out a slow breath, pulling out her phone to check for updates. A new message from Daniel appeared. "Daniel, you sure you don't want me to escalate this? You know Carter's history, right?" Maya frowned. She hadn't looked into him yet. "Maya, what history?" "Daniel, just checked. Multiple complaints filed against him. All dismissed. Pattern of targeting black and brown passengers." "Maya, of course. Daniel, you still want to handle this your way?" Maya's grip on her phone tightened. This wasn't just about her. This was a pattern, a repeated abuse of authority that had gone unchecked. She wanted to confront Carter, to put him in his place, but she knew that wasn't the way to win. If she was going to take him down, she had to be strategic. She typed back. "Maya, I'll handle it. But I'll need some files when I land." The plane began taxiing, and she put her phone away. As the engines roared to life, she closed her eyes and centered herself. This wasn't just another incident. This was an opportunity. Back at the airport, Officer Carter sat in the security office, drumming his fingers against the desk. The conversation with his supervisor hadn't gone the way he wanted. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint, maybe more than one. His supervisor had warned him, told him to be more careful and mind the optics. Carter hated that word, optics. It implied that what he was doing was wrong when, in his mind, he was just doing his job. He had instincts. He trusted them. He wasn't targeting people because of race. He was targeting people who didn't seem right. Still, the warning bothered him. He glanced at his computer screen, hesitating for a moment before pulling up the passenger manifest. He searched for Maya Lawson. FBI. His stomach twisted. That explained a lot. No wonder she had handled herself so well. No wonder she hadn't cowered or snapped at him like others had. She had power. The kind of power that could ruin his career. His mind raced. Had he gone too far? For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in. The flight landed smoothly in Washington, D.C., and Maya grabbed her bag, moving through the terminal with a renewed sense of focus. She had made up her mind. Instead of heading straight to her hotel, she went directly to FBI headquarters. Inside the vast, sleek building, she made her way to Daniel's office. Daniel was already waiting, a folder in his hand. He was tall, with a shaved head and a no-nonsense demeanor, but with Maya, he always let his guard down. "You're really going after this guy, huh?" he said, handing her the file. Maya flipped it open, scanning the records. Carter had been accused of racial profiling at least 6 times. All cases were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. She looked up at Daniel. "If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing it." Daniel nodded. "So, what's the plan?" Maya closed the folder. "I'm going to make sure he answers it." Daniel smirked. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Maya sat across from Daniel in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting sharp shadows on the walls. The folder in front of her felt heavier than its actual weight. 6 complaints. 6 dismissed cases. How many others had gone unreported? Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You know how this goes, Maya. Unless there's undeniable proof, nothing sticks. The system protects its own. Maya clenched her jaw. She had seen it before, officers like Carter getting away with harassment under the guise of routine security checks. Each case dismissed as a misunderstanding, an overreaction, or, worst of all, something fabricated. She looked up. What if we make sure there is proof? Daniel raised an eyebrow. You have something in mind. Maya tapped her fingers against the folder. I want to talk to the people who filed complaints against him. If we can find a pattern, find someone willing to testify, we might have a case. Daniel sighed. That's a long shot. People move on, Maya. They don't want to relieve it. Then I'll make them want to. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll see what I can dig up. Maya closed the file. She had made up her mind. This wasn't just about Carter. It was about every officer who thought they could abuse their badge without consequence. Back at the airport, Carter sat in the break room, staring at his coffee. The room was empty, but he still felt like eyes were on him. His supervisor had pulled him aside again earlier that day. The complaints were gaining attention. Carter scoffed under his breath. Ridiculous, he muttered. But he wasn't as sure as he wanted to be. He had seen the way Maya looked at him before boarding her flight. It wasn't anger. It was something worse, determination. He pulled out his phone and searched her name. FBI agent Maya Lawson. A decorated investigator with years of experience. She wasn't just some disgruntled traveler. She was someone who could destroy him if she wanted to. His fingers tightened around his cup. He had a bad feeling about this. Later that evening, Maya sat in a small cafe across from the first name on her list, Andre Harris, a black man in his early 30s. He had filed a complaint against Carter 2 years ago after being aggressively searched and detained at the airport for no reason. Andre stirred his coffee, his face unreadable. I appreciate what you're doing, but I already tried. Nothing came of it. Maya leaned forward. I understand. But I need you to tell me everything again. If we can connect your case with others, we might be able to make something happen. Andre exhaled, rubbing his temple. Look, I don't have time to get caught up in this again. I got a family now. A job. I moved past it. Maya nodded, choosing her words carefully. I get that. But moving past it doesn't mean it won't happen again to someone else. To your son, one day. Andre flinched slightly. Maya saw it, the hesitation, the crack in his resolve. Finally, he sighed. All right. I'll tell you everything. Maya pulled out her notebook. This was just the beginning. Maya sat in her car, staring at the notes she had taken from her meeting with Andre Harris. His story mirrored her own experience with Carter: baseless suspicion, humiliation, and an abuse of power hidden behind airport security protocols. But what struck her most was what he had said before leaving. He looked at me like I was already guilty. Maya knew that feeling too well. It was the weight of judgment, the knowledge that someone had already decided who you were before you even spoke. She had seen it in Carter's eyes. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at the list of other names Daniel had sent her. More people. More complaints. Some had gone through official channels, others had simply walked away, knowing they wouldn't be believed. She picked up her phone and dialed the next number. Hello. A cautious voice answered. Hi, is this Jordan Patel? There was a pause. Who's asking? Maya softened her tone. My name is Maya Lawson. I'm with the FBI. I'm looking into Officer Carter from JFK Airport. I think you filed a complaint against him. Silence. Then, a bitter laugh. Yeah, I did. Not that it mattered. Maya gripped the phone tighter. I believe you. And I want to do something about it. Jordan hesitated, then sighed. Meet me tomorrow. But I can't promise anything. Maya smiled slightly. That's all I need. Carter walked through the terminal, scanning the travelers as if nothing had changed. But something had. He could feel it. His supervisor had called him into the office that morning, warning him that his record was under review. Someone was asking questions. Someone was digging. Carter already knew who. His pulse quickened as he walked past the security station. The other officers nodded at him in greeting, but he barely acknowledged them. His mind was elsewhere. She was trying to take him down. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the news, half expecting to see his name plastered across a headline. Nothing yet. But it was only a matter of time. He clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let this happen. The next day, Maya met Jordan Patel at a quiet park outside the city. He was younger than she expected, mid-20s, with sharp eyes that held years of frustration. You're serious about this? He asked as they sat on a bench. Maya nodded. Dead serious. Jordan exhaled. All right. Here's what happened. As he spoke, Maya's suspicion turned to certainty. His story was almost identical to Andre's. The same pattern. The same tactics. Carter wasn't just profiling people, he was targeting them. By the time Jordan finished, Maya had everything she needed. She stood up, shaking his hand. Thank you. This is going to help. Jordan gave her a wry smile. Just promise me he won't get away with it. Maya's eyes darkened with determination. I promise. That night, Maya compiled everything she had. Multiple complaints. A pattern of abuse. Names, dates, testimonies. It was enough to push forward. She sent the files to Daniel with a simple message. Maya, we have him. Let's move. Her phone buzzed almost instantly. Daniel, I'll make some calls. Are you sure you're ready for this? Maya stared at the screen, then typed her response. Maya, more than ever. Maya stood outside the FBI headquarters, the early morning air crisp against her skin. She held her coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, rereading the message from Daniel. Daniel, meeting set for noon. The DOJ rep will be there. We need this airtight. She took a slow sip, letting the caffeine settle her nerves. This was it. Months of injustice, years of unchecked power. Carter wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a larger problem. But today, she had the chance to do something about it. She exhaled sharply, put her phone away, and walked inside. Daniel was waiting in a conference room, papers spread across the table. His usual calm demeanor was edged with tension. Across from him sat Rachel Monroe, a Department of Justice investigator with a reputation for being ruthless when it came to civil rights violations. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Do you have proof? Maya slid a thick folder across the table. Multiple complaints. Same officer. Same pattern. And I have 2 victims willing to testify. Rachel flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. We'll need more. Maya's stomach clenched. More? Carter has a documented history. Rachel raised a hand. I don't doubt that. But officers like him don't go down easy. If we push this and it falls apart, he walks away untouchable. I need irrefutable evidence. The kind that can't be explained away. Maya's hands curled into fists. She had come too far for this to be dismissed. Daniel leaned forward. What if we catch him in the act? Rachel arched an eyebrow. Go on. Maya's pulse quickened. She could see where this was going. If he's predictable, we can control the situation, Daniel said. Set him up. Get him on tape. The moment he oversteps, we have him. Rachel considered this, tapping her fingers against the table. Risky. But effective. She turned to Maya. Are you willing to put yourself in his crosshairs again? Maya didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The plan was simple. Maya would fly back to JFK, going through security like any other traveler. She would give Carter no reason to suspect she was part of a sting operation. Meanwhile, undercover DOJ agents and FBI personnel would be stationed nearby, recording everything. The moment Carter crossed the line, they would move in. That night, as Maya packed her bag, she felt the familiar weight of nerves pressing against her ribs. She had been in dangerous situations before, undercover operations, high-risk arrests, but this felt personal. This wasn't just about catching Carter. It was about proving that people like him couldn't keep hiding behind a badge. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Daniel, you sure about this? She typed back. Maya, I need to do this. She turned off the light and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, it would all be over. One way or another. Maya adjusted the strap of her bag as she approached the security checkpoint at JFK Airport. Her heartbeat was steady, controlled, but beneath the surface, adrenaline surged through her veins. She had been here before, this exact terminal, this exact routine, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just a traveler. She was bait. She scanned the area, careful not to make it obvious. A few travelers shuffled impatiently in line, officers stationed at various points, directing people through the scanners. Among them, she spotted the undercover agents, a woman pretending to scroll through her phone, a man with headphones nodding to imaginary music. They were in place. Then, she saw him. Officer Carter. He was standing at the checkpoint, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. When they landed on her, Maya saw the flicker of recognition. His lips pressed into a thin line. He remembered her. Maya stepped forward, handing her passport and boarding pass to the agent at the desk. The woman barely glanced at them before waving her through. As she approached the security conveyor belt, she placed her bag into the bin, removed her shoes, and raised her arms for the body scanner. Carter stepped in front of her before she could move forward. You, he said, his voice low but firm. Maya kept her expression neutral. Is there a problem, officer? Carter's eyes narrowed. Step aside. The tension in the air thickened. People behind her shifted uncomfortably, whispering. The agents watching from a distance remained still, waiting for the moment to act. Maya didn't resist. She stepped to the side as Carter motioned for another officer to continue processing the rest of the passengers. Then, he turned back to her, arms crossed. I remember you, he said, his voice edged with something between suspicion and hostility. Maya tilted her head slightly. Is that so? You caused a scene last time. Maya held his gaze. No, Officer Carter. You caused a scene. His jaw tightened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. What are you doing here? Maya shrugged. Traveling. Like everyone else. Carter studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a separate screening area. We need to do an additional search. The words hung in the air. Travelers shuffled past, trying to avoid eye contact, sensing the shift in energy. Maya exhaled through her nose. On what grounds? Carter smirked. Random selection. Maya forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly what she had anticipated. She cast a quick glance toward the undercover agents. They were recording. She could almost feel their cameras locked onto her, capturing every moment. Fine, she said. Let's do this. Carter led her to a more secluded area of the checkpoint, where another officer, a younger recruit, stood by, looking slightly uneasy. "Turn around," Carter ordered. Maya complied. She heard the snap of latex gloves. Then, the pat-down began. It didn't take long for Carter to cross the line. His hands lingered longer than necessary, pressing in places they shouldn't. The moment his fingers brushed against the waistband of her jeans, Maya turned sharply. "That's enough," she said, her voice clear and strong. Carter gave her a smirk. "Relax. Just doing my job." "No," she said. "You're abusing it." Before he could respond, a new voice cut through the air. "That's enough, Officer Carter." Carter froze. Rachel Monroe stepped forward, flashing her DOJ credentials. Behind her, Daniel and several uniformed officers moved in. Carter looked between them, his face paling. "What?" Rachel didn't let him finish. "We've been watching you, Carter. We have your history. We have your victims. And now, we have you on tape." Maya crossed her arms, watching as realization dawned on his face. For the first time, Carter looked truly afraid. "Officer Carter," Rachel continued, "you are under investigation for misconduct, racial profiling, and civil rights violations. You are hereby relieved of duty pending formal charges." The younger officer standing beside Carter immediately stepped away, his face a mask of shock. Carter turned to Maya, his expression twisting into something between anger and desperation. "You set me up." Maya met his glare with an unwavering stare. "No, Carter. You set yourself up." As the agents moved in, placing him in handcuffs, a hush fell over the surrounding travelers. People paused mid-step, their eyes darting between the officers and Carter. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Maya took a slow breath. It was over. Or at least, the first part was. As Carter was escorted away, Daniel turned to Maya. "You okay?" She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "Yeah. Just thinking about what comes next." Daniel nodded. "The fight's not over yet." "No," Maya said, watching Carter disappear from sight. "But this is a damn good start." The weight of the moment settled over Maya as she watched Officer Carter disappear through the terminal in handcuffs. The air felt different now, as if the entire airport had shifted in some intangible way. People continued moving through security, but their eyes lingered on the scene. Some whispered, others simply shook their heads, but Maya could see the quiet recognition that something significant had just happened. Daniel stood beside her, hands on his hips. "We got him." Maya exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, we did." But she knew this wasn't the end. One arrest wouldn't undo the damage Carter had caused. It wouldn't erase the humiliation and trauma he had inflicted on so many people before her. And it certainly wouldn't fix the deeper issues that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked. The real work was just beginning. Maya spent the next few days buried in paperwork, going over every detail of the case with the DOJ and FBI internal affairs. Rachel Monroe, relentless as ever, ensured that the investigation into Carter expanded beyond just his actions at the airport. If there were more officers involved, more patterns of discrimination, they would find them. Meanwhile, the media had picked up the story. FBI agent harassed at JFK airport, officer under investigation for racial profiling. Maya scrolled through the news articles, her emotions a tangled mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Interviews with former victims had surfaced, each telling stories eerily similar to hers. Some had fought back. Others had walked away, unwilling to endure the battle. But now, they had a voice. Daniel knocked on the side of her desk. "Press wants a statement." Maya set down her phone. "Of course, they do." Rachel, standing nearby, crossed her arms. "This case is bigger than just Carter. If you speak, make it about that. About the system that let him operate this long. Maya nodded. She already knew what she would say. The press conference was held outside the FBI field office, cameras flashing as Maya stepped up to the podium. She took a steadying breath before speaking. As a law enforcement officer, I swore an oath to uphold justice, she began. That means justice for all, not just the privileged, not just those who fit a certain profile. What happened to me at JFK Airport was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue, one that has impacted far too many innocent people for far too long. She paused, scanning the crowd. No one should have to fear discrimination at the hands of those sworn to protect them. We cannot allow bad officers to taint the integrity of an entire system. That is why investigations like this matter. That is why speaking up matters. A reporter raised a hand. Agent Lawson, do you believe Officer Carter is just one of many? Maya met the reporter's gaze. I believe Officer Carter is a symptom of a larger problem. And we're just getting started. Later that evening, Maya sat on her apartment balcony, staring out at the city lights. The case wasn't over. Carter would face trial, but the legal system would decide his fate. She had done her part, at least for now. Her phone buzzed with a message from Andre Harris, the man who had first inspired her to dig deeper. Andre, you did it? Maya smiled softly before typing back. Maya, no. We did. She set her phone aside and leaned back, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Tomorrow, there will be more battles to fight. But tonight, she would allow herself this victory. Maya walked into the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The air was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the hallways, cameras flashing as they captured every movement. She kept her head high, her expression unreadable, but inside, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Officer Carter sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his face drained of the arrogance he had once carried so effortlessly. His legal team murmured to one another, occasionally casting glances at Maya and the DOJ attorneys sitting beside her. The trial had been a whirlwind of testimonies, evidence, and cross-examinations. Witnesses had come forward, people who had been harassed, humiliated, and wrongfully detained by Carter over the years. Their voices painted a damning picture, one that was impossible to ignore. Today, the jury would deliver their verdict. The judge entered, and the courtroom stood. When everyone was seated again, the jury foreperson stood, holding the small slip of paper that would decide the outcome. In the case of the United States versus Officer Richard Carter, on the charge of misconduct and violation of civil rights, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Maya felt her chest tighten, but she remained still, watching Carter's reaction. His jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. The judge moved swiftly, setting a sentencing date and ordering Carter to be taken into custody. Maya exhaled slowly. Justice had been served, at least in this case. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, microphones pushed in her direction. Daniel and Rachel stood close by, ready to intervene if needed. A reporter fired the first question. Agent Lawson, how do you feel about today's verdict? Maya took a moment before answering. Relieved. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about the system that allowed him to operate for so long. Until that system changes, cases like this will continue to happen. Another journalist stepped forward. What happens next? Maya squared her shoulders. We keep going. We hold people accountable. We push for reform. This is only the beginning. Later that evening, Maya sat in her office, staring at the wall of case files in front of her. The Carter case was closed, but new ones had already begun. Complaints were pouring in, people emboldened by what had happened, finally finding the courage to speak up. Daniel knocked on the door, holding 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of her. You know, most people would take a break after something like this. Maya smirked. You know I'm not most people. He chuckled, shaking his head. So what's next? She picked up a file from the pile. We go after the next one. Daniel raised his cup in a mock toast. To justice. Maya clinked her cup against his. To never stop. Maya stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp evening air. The flashing cameras had dimmed, the crowd of reporters slowly dispersing now that they had their headlines. She pulled her coat tighter around her, letting out a deep breath as the tension of the day began to settle. The trial was over, and Carter would face the consequences of his actions. But Maya knew this wasn't the end, it was just another chapter in the long fight ahead. As she reached the parking lot, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Proud of you. Your father would be too. Call me when you get home. Maya smiled softly, a wave of warmth washing over her. Her father had spent his life fighting for justice in his own way, and though he wasn't here to see this moment, she felt his presence. She glanced up at the night sky before getting into her car. This battle was won, but the war against injustice was far from over. Over the next few weeks, the fallout from Carter's case rippled through the justice system. His conviction set off a chain reaction. More officers were investigated, policies were re-examined, and pressure mounted for deeper reforms within law enforcement. Maya found herself at the center of discussions about racial profiling and systemic discrimination, invited to speak at panels and contribute to policy discussions. One morning, she sat across from a group of community leaders in a packed conference room. The topic: police accountability. This isn't about painting all officers as bad, Maya said, meeting the eyes of the room. It's about making sure the ones who abuse their power are held accountable. And more importantly, making sure the system doesn't protect them. A woman in the crowd raised her hand. What can we do to make sure this doesn't keep happening? Maya leaned forward. We keep speaking up. We push for policies that protect civilians, that demand transparency. We make sure this case wasn't just a one-time victory but a step toward real change. Weeks turned into months. Maya continued her work, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. She helped train officers on racial bias, pushed for independent oversight committees, and worked to build trust between communities and law enforcement. One evening, she walked into a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, where Andre Harris was waiting for her at a corner table. He had been instrumental in bringing Carter's past to light, and they had stayed in touch throughout the case. You really don't take a break, do you? Andre said with a grin as she sat down. Maya smirked, sipping her coffee. Not when there's still work to do. He nodded. You know, I was thinking, maybe it's time we stop just reacting to these cases and start changing things before they happen. Maya raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? A mentorship program. For young people who might be interested in law enforcement but don't trust the system? We teach them how to navigate it. We show them how to make a difference from the inside. Maya considered it. The idea had weight. Real impact. You think people would be interested? Andre leaned back. After what you just did? I think people would follow you anywhere. Maya chuckled, shaking her head. This isn't about me. No, Andre agreed. But you're the spark that started something big. Months later, Maya stood before a group of young recruits at a training academy, her heart swelling with a different kind of pride. She had fought battles in the courtroom, in the field, and in policy meetings. But this shaping the next generation felt just as important. She took a breath and spoke. Justice isn't a one-time event. It's not a single case, a single victory. It's a fight we take on every day, in every decision we make. We are here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. And if we do our jobs right, one day, we won't have to keep fighting the same battles over and over again. As she looked into the eager eyes of the recruits, she knew this was only the beginning. The war against injustice would never be easy. But Maya Lawson was ready for whatever came next. Months had passed since the courtroom doors had closed on the Carter case, but Maya's work had only intensified. She had become a recognizable name in the fight against racial injustice, invited to discussions, policy meetings, and reform panels. But more than anything, she had become a mentor to those who once felt powerless, people who had seen the system fail them time and time again. One evening, she found herself back at JFK Airport, walking past the very spot where her ordeal had begun. The sting of that day still lingered, but it no longer held power over her. Instead, it reminded her why she fought. Her phone buzzed. Rachel Monroe, big meeting tomorrow. Civilian Oversight Board proposal is gaining traction. You in? Maya smirked. Maya, always. She tucked her phone away and kept walking, feeling a quiet sense of victory. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. The next day, Maya stood before a room filled with community leaders, police officials, and activists. The topic was one she had been pushing for months: independent oversight for law enforcement misconduct cases. Accountability isn't about making enemies, Maya said, scanning the room. It's about restoring trust. When the system holds itself accountable, the public can believe in it again. A police chief folded his arms. And you think an oversight board will fix that? Maya met his gaze. I think it's a start. The discussion lasted hours, but by the end, progress had been made. The proposal was moving forward. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but Maya knew this was how it started, one step at a time. That evening, Maya sat at her mother's kitchen table, sipping tea as the soft hum of the city filled the apartment. It had been too long since she had taken a moment to just be home. Her mother watched her carefully. You look tired. Maya chuckled. I am. But you're happy. Maya nodded, setting down her cup. For the first time in a long time. Her mother reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Your father would be proud. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. I hope so. Her mother smiled. I know so. As Maya walked out into the cool night air, she felt something unfamiliar. Not exhaustion. Not anger. Not frustration. Hope. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But now, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. And that made all the difference. The end.